When using a compass, there are two things you need to know: magnetic north and your azimuth, which is the direction you need to go to reach your goal. In the United States, our political and moral compasses are off track, but it doesn't have to be that way. Come with me as I explore realistic options on how to improve our country. This is Off Azimuth. Beginning in the 1970s, the United States became entangled in an international conflict. It wasn't Vietnam. The last of the United States service members and civilians had been evacuated 5 years before this began. It wasn't the Cold War with the USSR. That war of espionage and posturing would end 11 years later with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm referring instead to the financial conflict that began as China emerged as an economic world leader. In 1966, Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong believed that the communist ideology that had taken control of mainland China in 1949 was under attack, not from external forces like Japan, as seen in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Mao Zedong believed that their way of life was under attack by capitalism, which had infiltrated regional governments through intellectuals and traditionalists. He called upon young people, many students, to form cadres of Red Guards throughout the country, and proclaimed that to rebel is justified. Only through physical resistance could the subversive elements be driven out of China. Beginning in Beijing in August of 1966, the Red August, as it came to be known, resulted in 1,772 people killed, 33,695 homes ransacked, and 85,196 families forcibly displaced, all in the name of preserving communism. The massacre in Beijing officially began the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, later shortened to just the Cultural Revolution. Over the next decade, the Red Guard began seizing power from local governments and party branches, and establishing themselves as new revolutionary committees, all while smashing public security and judicial systems. The country's schools and universities were closed. Over 10 million youth from urban areas were displaced to more rural regions. The Red Guard sought to destroy what they called the Four Olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. While removal of the bourgeoisie countered the rise of consumerism, the destruction of old temples and practices countered the traditionalists who sought to return to pre-communist China. By the end of the decade of violence, tens of millions were persecuted, including senior officials, intellectuals, and scientists. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, but range between 1 to 2 million people, famously including a massacre in Yangshi that included acts of cannibalism. Throughout the Cultural Revolution, China's borders remained closed. Social productivity was low, the economy was stagnant, and advancements in science, technology, and education ground to a halt. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, China's population was about 950 million people, of which 250 million were starving and didn't have enough clothing. Economic growth had halted, and in a time when Western nations and regional rivals like Japan were showing drastic growth in their respective gross domestic products, both the United States and Japan saw GDP growth of approximately 5% in 1976. China's economy was moving backwards, with a negative 1.6% growth that same year. Change began with Deng Xiaoping coming to power. Deng acknowledged that without investment in China's infrastructure and welcoming foreign businesses, their country stood no chance of evolving beyond the Cultural Revolution. In 1978, he led the development and creation of the Reform and Opening Up Act. He believed it was time for the government to shift from taking class struggle as the guiding principle to the construction of socialist modernization. His focus was to reform internally, open up externally. The act saw the Chinese government shuttering ineffective state-owned enterprises, instead enabling the transfer of these services to the private market. It opened urban areas to rural migration into the major cities by creating a privatized real estate market following the turnover of previously state-owned housing. Its greatest accomplishment was providing financial incentives to foreign investors willing to establish a foothold in the burgeoning Chinese infrastructure. Deng created special economic zones, or SEZs, that served as benchmarks for economic reform by attracting foreign businesses. These SEZs offered tax brackets to foreign enterprises and established joint ventures, which created easier market entry by partnering foreign investors with Chinese businesses. They waived tariffs on imported equipment and materials, and they enabled profit repatriation for the first time in decades, allowing foreign companies to transfer profits back to their home countries. Deng's efforts showed dividends immediately. In 1978, China's annual GDP growth rate was 11.7%, a 13.3% change from the year previous. That same year, the United States GDP growth rate was 5.6%, and Japan's was 5.5%, which showed little change from the year before. China's growth wouldn't slow in the subsequent decades. 40 years of interstate peace in the region, free trade agreements, and China's induction into the World Trade Organization in 2001 significantly boosted China's trade potential. From 1978 to 2018, China's GDP growth rate only dropped below 7% 6 times. Even accounting for the few statistical outliers, during those same 40 years, China's average GDP growth rate was 9.55%. During that same period, the United States' peak GDP growth rate was 7.2% in 1984, but the average rate was 2.7%. The Reform and Opening Up Act began a massive transition in Chinese economic power. In 1995, it placed a greater emphasis on college education. China went from only having 8% of its college-aged population enrolled in post-secondary institutions to over 50% graduating with a college degree. The increased quality of its labor force made China a global competitor and improved the country's value in manufacturing and services. In 2026, China has become the leading country in manufacturing and telecommunications. It dominates the market in e-commerce, being home to major platforms like Alibaba, which has $141 billion in revenue in 2025, and JD.com, with $191.6 billion of revenue that same year. China has invested greatly in renewable resources and is the largest producer of solar panels, wind turbines globally, and electric vehicles. The relatively quick rise of China's economic power has displaced the previous economic hegemonies, primarily the G7. Formed in 1975, the G7 is a group of 7 advanced economies: the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. The G7 held the ability to sway or stabilize global markets, making them the foundation for international trade. By 1990, those 7 countries held 66% of the worldwide GDP. Its global influence, dominion over trade dynamics, and control of investment flows was unmatched. Over time, as the economic hold of the G7 waned, other countries rose to power. In 2006, Brazil, Russia, India, and China created BRIC, which would be expanded to BRICS following South Africa joining in 2010. BRICS was an economic counterpoint to the G7. It focused on reforming global financial institutions and encouraging trade deals and investments outside the major Western powers. It has pushed for a de-dollarization of world economies, reducing the reliance on the US dollar as reserve currency. BRICS implemented initiatives that could reform the global financial system. The organization created the New Development Bank in 2015, which provides loans, guarantees, and technical assistance to member countries and emerging economies. The New Development Bank serves as a counter to the primarily westernized International Monetary Fund and World Bank. BRICS also created the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which provides a pool of resources that is available to member countries should they face balance of payment issues or during times of economic stress. As of 2026, BRICS now consists of 10 members and 10 additional partner nations. As BRICS has risen to power, the G7's influence has lessened considerably. According to the International Monetary Fund, in 2025, the G7, which had once boasted as much as 2/3 of the global share of GDP, controlled only 28.4%. Challenges like inflation, recent global trade tensions, and the lasting effect of the pandemic have kept the G7's GDP growth rate at only 1.7%, with only the US and Canada exceeding the average. The global economic control of BRICS Plus has grown inversely to the G7. According to Geopolitical Economy, BRICS now makes up 44% of the global GDP, 43.93% of the global economy, and 55.61% of the global population. With a dwindling control of the global market, the United States needed to find another outlet by which it could influence national partnerships. They needed an organization that could lay inroads to countries previously inaccessible to the United States, either financially or militarily. It found that in the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Established in 1961 to help counter the influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, USAID was the successor to the International Cooperation Administration that had been established in 1955. USAID managed the United States programs in low-income countries, including disaster relief, poverty relief, technical cooperation on the global environment, and socioeconomic development. Geographical Weekly provided a compilation of USAID's recent accomplishments. Between 2017 and 2020, USAID responded to more than 240 natural disasters and crises around the world, including famines in the Republic of South Sudan and conflicts in Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Lake Chad Basin. From 2012 to 2017, it supported more than 5 million survivors of gender-based violence through medical care, counseling, and legal help. In 2016 alone, the organization provided food assistance to more than 53 million people in 47 countries. In 2020, USAID helped eradicate the wild polio virus in Africa through its vaccination program. Prior to the program, it was estimated that around 75,000 children were paralyzed each year after contracting polio. 2023 saw USAID providing assistance to 130 countries, dispersing $71.9 billion in foreign aid through economic development, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance. USAID laid the foundation by which U.S. embassies around the world were able to establish political, economic, and military cooperation between the United States and the affected country. Over the past 60 years, the organization has served as the primary soft power counter to rivals like Russia and China. For those not familiar with the term, soft power refers to a country's ability to influence or persuade others without coercion, instead relying on the use of economics or cultural influence. The opposite of that is hard power, which is a country's ability to influence through military might and threats of economic retribution. While absolutely a humanitarian organization, USAID served as a barrier against Russia's and China's global influence. It provided relief efforts worldwide that otherwise would have been managed by political rivals. In February of 2025, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi said, "I have felt for a long time that USAID was our way to combat the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's effort to really gain influence around the world, including Africa and South America in the Western Hemisphere." That influence is easily recognized in countries like Panama. In 2023, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Panama must reduce its collaboration with China. He emphasized the same during a 2025 visit to the Panama Canal, which serves as the major shipping throughput between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Whereas Rubio and President Trump have been aggressive in their dealings with Panama, leaning more toward the hard power aspect, China has continued to influence Central and South American nations through extended soft power. In 1997, the Hong Kong-based Hutchinson Ports Company began managing the Balboa Port on the Pacific coast and the Cristobal Port on the Atlantic side, as well as handling logistics at both ends of the canal. It served as the primary maintainer of the ports until 2026, when Panama's top court voided their contract. While Hutchinson Ports is not a Chinese government-owned company, its parent location in Hong Kong means it operates under Chinese financial laws. It operates over 50 ports worldwide in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Despite losing its control over the Panama Canal, China's influence is still deeply entrenched in the country. As part of the Belt and Roads Initiative, China constructed the Panama City Metro, built a new international airport in Panama City, and invested in renewable energy projects, including hydroelectric plants. As of 2024, China had completed all but the last 55 miles of the Pan American Highway, a road that runs nearly 18,000 miles, minus the incomplete area through the Darien Gap, and connects Argentina to Alaska. With such a heavy financial investment in their infrastructure, what incentive is there for Panama to completely cut ties with China? And Panama isn't an isolated incident. Since launching its Belt and Roads Initiative in 2013, China has poured nearly $1 trillion into infrastructure and development projects across 140 countries, many of which are resource-rich nations. This includes spending $11.8 billion in South Africa on their energy infrastructure, $12.3 billion spent in Malaysia on transportation and storage projects, $5.3 billion spent on mining and construction projects in Chile, and an unbelievable $100.4 billion towards banking and financial services in Argentina. Despite criticism that their overseas investments induces economic dependency in poorer nations, none of these countries have incentive to endanger their relationship with China. This is further exacerbated when you realize that China's overseas investments surpassed those of the United States by nearly tenfold. USAID and the foreign aid provided was the counter to China's influence. By proactively establishing ongoing medical care, infrastructure improvements, and government support, the United States was able to thwart the influence of other nations in countries that we deemed important to financial or national security. But USAID no longer exists. On January 24, 2025, USAID funding was frozen for 90 days, and most of its employees were put on administrative leave. Several days later, more than 1,000 USAID employees were fired or furloughed. On 9 March, the Famine Early Warning System Network, a USAID program that provided 8-month projections on food scarcity and was considered the global standard, had stopped operating. The next day, Secretary of State Rubio announced that 83% of the USAID programs would be canceled. These included 30 clinical trials for HIV, malaria, cholera, cervical cancer, and tuberculosis. it was a freeze on $276 million being sent to Sudan to assist with their estimated 3 million children suffering from acute malnutrition. After the 28 March earthquake in Myanmar, which killed more than 3,000, the major international players provided on-the-ground support in the medical care, recovery, and rebuilding efforts. Countries like Russia, China, and Vietnam dispatched specialized teams and pledged significant financial support totaling millions of dollars. The United States, now lacking a formal department to manage its disaster response, announced that it was working through local partners to provide aid rather than providing any on-the-ground assets. Compare the Myanmar response to the 2010 Haiti earthquake response, which saw over 20,000 civilians and military personnel deployed to carry out search and rescue operations, provide life-saving medical services, including the deployment of the USNS Comfort, one of the Navy's floating hospitals, and help meet basic food, water, and shelter needs for the displaced people. At the May 2010 Haiti Donors Conference, the United States further pledged $1.15 billion across fiscal years 2010 and 2011 for Haiti's reconstruction. A former USAID mission head stated, "This is the new normal. This is what it looks like when the United States sits on the international sidelines, when the United States is a weaker international player, when it cedes the space to other global players like China." The programs that the United States established under USAID, including the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was established in 2003 and invested nearly $110 billion to fight AIDS, will now be fulfilled by others willing to invest large amounts of money on a global stage. However, in the intervening time between the United States ending the programs and another country initiating it again, it's estimated that more than 150,000 preventable deaths from AIDS will occur because we no longer provide that support. These programs, once seeded by the United States, will be maintained primarily by China. If future administrations decide to reinstitute USAID, these countries won't accept our aid. The trust is already broken. Which is the crux of this discussion. What the United States is discovering is that our relationships with our foreign partners weren't based off mutual respect or national affection. Our relationships were transactional. An article by Tino Cuellar in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it eloquently. One issue is the challenge of reimagining international governments in a de-Americanizing world. Political capital is scarce, and domestic and international allies' willingness to accept or support change is finite. Failure to use political capital to advance an agenda risks having some of it melt, as windows for policy change close. Sensible leaders ignore political capital scarcity at their peril, as bounced checks on the reputational bank often cost more than they predict. This move towards isolationism isn't a modern political movement. In his farewell address in 1796, George Washington warned the nation to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. That isolationist mentality carried through the start of the First World War. When the United States entered the war in 1917, much of the nation opposed sending troops to what it viewed as a European issue. Even when the war ended, it didn't end with great fanfare, but instead with a sense of futility. Riding this movement away from globalization, the Senate rejected the League of Nations membership in 1920. By the 1930s, the United States participated in trade wars that deepened the international financial depression. While an isolationist mentality is a positive approach to foreign wars, it does little to strengthen necessary international relations. Since October 2024, the global perception of the United States' influence on world affairs has dropped from 59% reporting the U.S. has a strong or somewhat positive influence to 46% in April of 2025. This is seen in the depreciation of the U.S. dollar. A Morgan Stanley report in 2025 showed that the US dollar's value against other currencies dropped 11%, with an estimation that it could drop another 10% by the end of 2026. A perceived weakness of the American dollar, usually seen as the standard in global trade, could negatively impact future trade deals, including agriculture that is already projected to lose $44 billion in the 2025 to 2026 harvest season. There is only one real way to fix this growing problem. The United States must reassert itself as a leader in humanitarian assistance. Every step away from the global stage has invited political and financial rivals to take our place. As the economic power of the G7 dwindles and the strength of BRICS grows, the United States stands to lose significant market share. With recent political decisions pulling the United States away from international trade and military support, the world has moved on without us. At the end of January 2026, India and the European Union signed a trade pact labeled the Mother of All Deals. The pact creates a market worth roughly $27 trillion in combined gross domestic product and covers a free trade area of about 2 billion people. Canada recently concluded a free trade deal with China after its leadership announced a determination to move away from the single dominant market. Following the deal, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stated that the old order is not coming back. His statement underscored a geopolitical realignment. Even previously established deals involving the United States, such as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, will now undergo a formal review in July of 2026 that could lead to its extension, modification, or even expiration. Bill Reinsch of the Center for Strategic and International Studies pointed out that trade is increasing, but it's rearranging or realigning, and what's happening is basically countries are moving on without the United States. Countries are making decisions that run counter to the United States' vision, not just economically, but militarily. During the ongoing conflict in Iran, Spain, traditionally a staunch U.S. ally, refused to let U.S. planes involved in the conflict fly over their airspace. It may already be too late to reinstate USAID, but even in the absence of a dedicated humanitarian organization, the United States needs to reassert itself as a leader in global soft power. Soft power doesn't just come from our humanitarian efforts. Participation in collaborative efforts shows a willingness to contribute on a global scale, keeping our country topical and ensuring that other countries look at us favorably. These global efforts include the Montreal Protocol, which was an environmental agreement in 1987 to limit the use of ozone-depleting chemicals. 197 countries and the European Union have ratified the program. In 2025, Senator Mike Lee called for the United States to withdraw from the Montreal Protocol, saying it's scientifically outdated and unfair towards the U.S. The recent rescissions bill halted $9 billion of money earmarked for international efforts, including the money that the U.S. would have contributed to the protocol. Similarly, the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which is a United Nations treaty on climate change adopted by 194 countries. The United States joined in 2016 after the agreement entered into force, but withdrew initially in 2020, only to rejoin in 2021, before again withdrawing in January of 2026. Here is the most important part of these global initiatives. The United States administrations don't have to agree with the content of either the Montreal Protocol or the Paris Agreement, but participation in both shows solidarity with the rest of the world and expands our nation's soft power. The longer we stall, the longer we refrain from helping these developing nations that have relied on our aid, or join collaborative efforts on climate change, the more likely it is that countries will refuse natural resource trade deals vital to U.S. manufacturing, instead offering those same deals to the countries that are supporting them, like China. At some point, we must acknowledge that our allies don't actually like us. We have always had a transactional relationship with the world. But once we stop providing support, we'll very quickly realize where we stand on the global stage. And once we're gone, China will supplant the United States as the world's financial leader, all without firing a shot. Thank you for tuning in.